So, unlike the other regions that we've looked at, populism in Africa is very interesting, but very understudied. So, as you may be aware of by now, most cross-regional comparisons of populism has focused on Latin America and Europe, and this is partly reflected in the structure of this course, right? So, this is the first year that we've included populism in Africa, but there is some content out there and some case studies. What you might notice is that the literature on populism in Africa is quite divorced from the literature on populism elsewhere, and it's only recently the scholars have been trying to mould or to apply concepts and theories of populism that originated, say, in the West or in Latin America to other contexts, including Africa. So that's one thing I want you to consider when you're doing research for this, if you're doing the presentations, or just if it's something you're interested in more broadly. And also, think about the extent to which populism and the concepts of populism as we've covered them, to what extent do they apply to the African context? And the other thing to note is obviously, in some ways, it makes sense to talk about populism in Africa as a whole because there are similarities, but again, there are massive differences between countries, obviously, and within countries. So when we talk about Africa, we're lumping in we're like North Africa with Sub-Saharan Africa. We're lumping together the more Muslim areas in the north, the more Christian areas in the south, with different imperial legacies, for instance. With different levels of ethnic conflict within and between states, different levels of development. So obviously, on a continent that's about, I think, 54 countries large, there's going to be a lot of diversity. So that's something that I'm using Africa. We've only got so many weeks. In an ideal world, in an ideal world, we'd study populism all day, every day. But we only have 11 lecture contact hours. So we're treating a very diverse place in 1 week. So please, if you are interested in this, there's a lot more scope for research. So what we're going to be doing in this is understanding the history and context of populism in Africa and key differences and similarities with European and Latin American understandings of populism, and situate African populism within the different definitions of populism we explored in week 1. We'll also be looking at how populism interacts with nationalism and ethnopopulism as a distinct concept, and what contexts ethnopopulism and populism more broadly can be a winning strategy, and in what contexts it might not be successful based on some historical examples. So Resnick argues that we need to take a cumulative conceptual approach when studying populism in Africa, and we need to combine the kind of three of the approaches that we've looked at. And interestingly, as you'll see, he doesn't mention Laclauian populism, discursive analysis, making a chain of equivalence of demands and blah 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 and all that, but he does mention Wayland, Osterguy and Mudd. So Wayland and his focus on populism as a political strategy based on personalistic leaders forging ties with a diverse and unorganised constituency for opportunistic purposes, with leaders who depend on mobilising a large majority of the population. If this is new to you, please revisit week 1. And this is important. Wayland's definition as a political strategy is important because, unlike in Latin America, North America or Europe, where parties are well institutionalized, they tend to have very clear programmatic or clear policy programs. The relative newness of democracy in Africa and party systems and the absence of mediating organizations means that many parties are essentially synonymous with their leaders in a way that they're not in other contexts. Osterguy's perspective stresses the populism essentially revolves around sociocultural performances, including what he terms the flaunting of the low. And we saw this come to the fore in our examination of Antipodean populism, where such performances rely on the use of popular, coarse, accessible and sometimes vulgar language, and often dramatic or colourful, even politically incorrect acts that grab the public's attention. And then we have Mudd's ideational approach, which we should all, if you don't know that by now, I'd panic, to be honest. And Mudd's approach is useful in the African context because some appeals to the people are made through ethnic frameworks, depending on courting just a slice of the population who align with the leader's own ascriptive identity. In addition, examples of kind of exclusionary ideological discourse include leaders who lack the direct form of intermediation that Wayland stresses, right? So it might not have that direct link to the people. And instead, leaders such as, say, Zimbabwe's Mugabe attempted to mobilise through decades-old political parties and with deep roots in communities in Zimbabwe, using this them and us ideology that framed how they saw or how they did politics. For Cheeseman, in the African context, populism should not be seen as a binary logic, but as a continuum on a spectrum in which the key question is not whether a leader is populist, but what proportion of a party's policies and appeals are underpinned by a populist logic. And that is obviously something you too can apply to any region, really, right? You can take a binary view of populism. A party is or isn't populist, or you can say on this dimension they're populist, on that dimension they're populist. Okay, that's something you can apply everywhere. Cheeseman argues it's specifically relevant in this context. Now, Cheeseman distinguishes between exclusionary populism that uses ethnicity to confront the dominant elites, and leaders that successfully used ethnopopulist appeals, like Michael Sata in Zambia, Raila Odinga in Kenya, and argues that the prospects for populism in Africa will depend on how ethnic and populist politics are reconciled. So we'll go into that in more detail. So it's been a while since I've made a graph, and it's the only thing that gets me out of bed in the morning. So here's one. This graph uses data from the Global Party Survey 2020, which uses expert assessments of the placement of political parties. The data set contains data for 45 of the 54 African countries, which are shown in the notes in the slide. There are issues with expert placements, right? It's not necessarily the best way of mapping parties, but again, it's because there's elements of subjectivity in there, but the people in charge of this try to mitigate this by using the averages of a number of experts. And they also ask how familiar they are. So it might not be perfect, but it's the best that we have. And what I've done is I've mapped every party in Africa that had the kind of the values entered in the data set on a standard left-right spectrum on the x-axis, and the y-axis shows social liberalism or social conservatism, 10 being socially conservative. The size of the dot corresponds to the party's vote share in the previous legislative election, and the colour represents whether they're classed as populist or not. Now, in this data set, populism is measured based on rhetoric. Okay, and the full question is also in the slide notes if you're interested. It asks people to place the parties on a 0 to 10 scale, and anything under 5 is classed as not populist, and anything over 5, including 5, is classed as populist. So in this instance, blue is populist, or is in the populist half, and the reddy pink is not populist. Now, the shaded kind of circly things show the space where the median 50% of parties are placed. And that's in terms of sheer number, right? So they're not weighted for kind of vote share or anything like that. These are just the so a party that gets 0.1% in an election will be weighted the same as a party that gets 55%. So it's not perfect, but again, there we are. And what we see is that the populist parties, so that's the blue bag, tend to be more centrist, i.e., you know, the mean is closer to 5 on the left-right spectrum, but they tend to be more socially conservative than their non-populist counterparts who span a greater range of the ideological space. Whereas, well, maybe it's not that much of a surprise, because in the European context, we differentiated between the populist radical left and the populist radical right. So, and that's, we've not done that here, but so like with Latin American populism, we can understand African populism through temporal periods, time periods. between the 1980s wave of populism and in the 2000 and in the 21st century. So, according to Resnick, a first generation of African populism emerged as a consequence of coups in the 1980s that were justified by military leaders as the only means of ousting corrupt incumbents who'd exacerbated macroeconomic mismanagement and undermined civilian welfare. Ghana is an example in 1981, which saw Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings oust the civilian government in a popular coup. Ideologically, he espoused the need for a social revolution, entreating Ghanaians to eliminate exploitation, and claiming his goal was to provide a chance for the people to be part of the decision-making process. This is, it's undeniably language of the populist, right? He was a personalistic leader with the nickname Junior Jesus, and argued that those who opposed him, typically the professional and managerial classes, churches, professional associations and traditional authorities, were labelled as neo-colonial establishment, and they faced severe penalties for perceived corruption. This is a common theme in African populism, where the other is articulated in terms of colonialism or imperialism. Similarly, a coup in the Republic of Upper Volta, which is now known as Burkina Faso, saw Captain Thomas Sankara adopt a similar approach. Sankara was a charismatic army officer who overthrew the military government, saying his revolution would take power out of the hands of our national bourgeoisie and their imperialist allies and put it in the hands of the people. And this concept of the people referred to the economically and politically marginalised who'd been exploited by the country's elite. He was strongly opposed to traditional leaders, particularly since he aimed to abolish private land ownership, as well as the middle class, civil servants and the country's trade unionists. So we see strong parallels with the early days of Latin American populism, even if the process or the articulated demands of African populists was not necessarily pro-democratic. Indeed, this first wave of African populism has some common characteristics to Latin American populism. Firstly, they attempted to establish direct ties with their populations through new local level avowedly participatory structures. Think back to what we know Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez tried to do. Secondly, these leaders grounded their populism in an anti-establishment discourse, and by portraying their usurpation of power as a people's revolution, they implied that they were acting in the interests of the general will and against the enemy of the people. The latter encompassed not only disappointing independence-era political elites, but also former colonial powers that had exploited African economies and undermined their prospect for genuine economic liberation. As Shazan et al. Argued in 1999, populist thought is fiercely nationalist and anti-imperialist, and its basis is deeply entrenched in frustration, anguish, negation and protest. Thirdly, these populists tended to pursue relatively similar economic strategies focused on heavy state intervention, import substitution industrialisation, ISI, and rural collectivisation schemes, and they were committed to equity and distribution through social welfare spending, subsidised commodities, and attempted land reform in rural areas, which we could see strong parallels with Latin American populism in the classical populist era. Fourthly, they aimed for a broader societal transformation, predicated on modernisation and equality by promoting women's rights and attacking traditional patriarchy, especially chiefly privilege in rural areas. Why? Well, because we know populists want to act as the voice of the people, right? They see themselves as being uniquely able to identify the will of the people, and traditional tribal power structures were mediating influences or institutions that populists saw as being able to articulate alternative forms of popular will based on ethnic tribal lines, which had to be removed because obviously, as we know from populism, the people are homogenous. There's no internal disagreement or no meaningful difference within the people. They are homogenous. And so ethnic tribal leaders run counter to that conception. And finally, this populism was not easily compatible with genuine democracy. Typically, rival political parties were banned, key rivals sidelined, and power concentrated in the leadership. Resnick argues that ultimately this first generation of populism became increasingly unsustainable, often due to economic reasons, which either resulted in the removal of the leader, usually violently, or prompted a sudden U-turn. So Ghana's severe financial crisis in 1982 forced Rawlings to gradually recalibrate his governing style, negotiate with the IMF, purge radical members of his government and appoint technocrats, whereas Ugandan populist Museveni's ultimate embrace of neoliberal economic reforms in Uganda quickly earned him a reputation as a donor darling. Clear links here, or parallels with Syriza in Greece. Indeed, macroeconomic crises forced most African governments to embark on structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s, and the resultant austerity or privatization programs often resulted in reduced consumer subsidies, growing unemployment, and then this provoked widespread discontent with incumbent governments and, coupled with conditions put on governments by donors, for things like political and economic liberalisation, multi-party democracy spread widely across the region during the 90s as a result. In some countries, the end of one-party rule resulted in a dramatic restructuring of the political party system. In fact, parties that had ruled for decades or more found that they were facing an uncertain future and needed to either mobilise new supporters or redouble efforts to retain their core constituency base. As a result, many political actors turned to populist rhetoric and ideology to do so. Incumbent parties that felt especially threatened by the prospect of competition pursued what Mudd and Kaltwasser characterised as exclusionary populism in order to discredit potential adversaries with support amongst particular constituencies. A key mechanism for doing this was through strongly ideological terms aimed at strategically redefining citizenship, often along ethnic or religious lines. True citizens were those who were from the incumbent party's historical constituent base, whilst foreigners were those who demonstrated greater support for the emerging opposition parties. Often this had ethnic or racial connotations as well. So in the Ivory Coast's first multi-party election, as it got closer in 1995, the incumbent party promoted the policy of Ivoirite. So any resident who lacked two Ivorian parents or who was not perceived as indigenous by the local community in which they lived was effectively disenfranchised. This had the benefit of also excluding a strong opposition contender and to discredit the opposition's predominantly Muslim supporters, who constituted more than a third of the population. A subsequent landlord effectively excluded those deemed non-Ivorian as deemed them ineligible to own land. So in this era, we see attempts by leaders to strategically recharacterise a particular demographic group, i.e. Christian Ivorians or, for example, black rural Zimbabweans, as their country's genuine citizens and thereby the pure people. Other groups, so Muslim Ivorians or white or urban Zimbabweans, were typically economically advantaged in terms of employment and business opportunities, and were by implication portrayed as the corrupt elite who benefited from exploiting the pure people. However, such leaders lacked many of the other characteristics identified in first-generation populism, including a moral purpose to represent the people and direct ties bolstered by socio-cultural performances that reintroduce an awareness of the plight of the masses. So this form of populism was more about the us-v-them dichotomy than it was about the direct links, for instance, or desire to help the poor. So populism was used more as a ideological divide and conquer strategy, rather than perhaps representing organic demands within society. More recently, in the 21st century, populist actors have found fertile ground in the failures of democratisation, especially the inability of opposition parties to oust underperforming incumbent parties, disillusionment with representative institutions and mechanisms of accountability, as well as particular socio-economic grievances that are perceived to be ignored by the political class. Indeed, as Resnick notes, empirically, contemporary manifestations of populism appear to be most prominent in Africa's electoral democracies and completely absent in its more authoritarian settings, which is, I think, interesting. South Africa, Kenya and Zambia all represent party systems where parties that spearheaded the democratisation effort became increasingly entrenched and corrupt, opening spaces for populist actors and movements to enter the fray. Similarly, economic factors have combined with urbanisation to produce a new forgotten class in cities. Unlike in the 1980s, when populist regimes were particularly concerned about exclusion of the peasant class, more contemporary populist strategies have been centred on urban areas and on the young, who are operating in a highly competitive employment environment. Wonder what that's like. Consequently, a common feature of contemporary populist strategies is a concentration on mobilising urbanites, and particularly the urban poor. Consisting of heterogeneous, unorganised masses, this constituency is often disillusioned with slum housing, lack of employment, poor service delivery, and frequent harassment by the ruling class. And we see a focus of the urban poor over perhaps the traditional rural poor. So, what's unique about African populism? Well, it's important to note that we're dealing with a party family or a worldview which necessarily travels between different contexts. So we do expect to see similarities between populist approaches in Africa and elsewhere, in the same way that we'd expect to see similarities or similar approaches between, say, liberal parties or socialist parties. But is there a unique flavour to African populism? Resnick argues the contemporary populist strategies witnessed in Africa consist of four key elements. The first is unmediated ties with the urban poor, anti-elitism, an economically eclectic but relatively programmatic message, and the combination of predominant appeals to the urban poor with ones linked to ethnicity, language and religion. Right, that aim to mobilise a select but sizable group of rural voters. So, while the former two characteristics nicely complement those found in other regions of the world, the latter two are slightly more distinct to the African context, Resnick argues. You might disagree. Unmediated ties take the form of nicknames given to leaders, alongside a flaunting of the low, so traditional dress or casual clothing, showing a close affinity to working class or traditional music, dancing, etc., using a common vernacular rather than French or English, Portuguese, the kind of former colonial language used by elites. And just showing that you're one of the people, right? You're one of the kind of non-elite indigenous people. This understanding of populism is obviously closely aligned to Wayland and /or Ostigai's definitions of populism. As Cheeseman notes, the context of African politics makes unmediated ties much more commonplace, given that parties tend to be weak, campaigns have limited policy content, and the ability to communicate with mass audiences via TV is typically limited to urban areas. Thus, face-to-face meetings become commonplace. Paget's research has found that campaign rallies are more important in Africa than anywhere else in the world. Under such conditions, populist forms of political communication and organisation, which do not rely on the existence of strong state or party structures, are likely to thrive. Now, when it comes to anti-elite rhetoric, what is ironic is the fact that most, if not all, populist leaders can't be considered outsiders to the prevailing political and economic establishment. Most, if not all, had served or had close ties to the government, and hence populism, whilst declaring a close affinity to the people, was actually more of a tool of distancing themselves from the elite or from established political actors, of which they were one. When it comes to economics, African populists tend to fuse left and right-wing approaches. Not surprising, really, given it's a thin-centred ideology, right? And instead of focusing on the means, there's a focus on the ends, right? For these populists, specifically addressing the priorities of the urban poor, e.g., unemployment, slum housing, and public services, and populists, at least especially the newer populists, were criticised for not concerning themselves with the needs of the rural poor. Still numerically critical for winning presidential elections, right? So there's just simply more rural poor than urban poor at the moment, anyway. And this, Resnick claims this is perhaps unique to African populism, but we see economically eclectic populist programs in lots of contexts, really, and you only have to think back over some of the previous lectures for some examples. As a result, Populists often combine populist strategies to mobilise the urban poor with ascriptive identity appeals to particular ethnic or religious groups in rural areas. So, they'd use populism for the urban areas and ethnic appeals for the rural areas. And this is easy because populism is a thin-centred ideology and ethno-nationalism is also a thin-centred ideology. Both can be seen as a form of identity politics. The former, so populism delineating identity based on morality, whilst ethnic appeals base it on ethnicity. The common factor here, when combining populist strategies with ascriptive appeals, is due to the emphasis on marginalisation. Feelings of exclusion and grievances over inequality among the urban poor have been complemented by perceptions among certain ethnic and religious groups of having been sidelined in the political sphere. For Cheeseman, speaking about sub-Saharan Africa specifically, it's not clear that a purely populist approach is compatible with a political context in which a great deal of electoral mobilisation occurs along ethnic lines. Because, although the weakness of party structures encourages leaders to use populist messages in order to connect directly to voters, the tendency to combine this with exclusive appeals that privilege certain communities means there's a limit to how broadly popular they can be. So essentially, populists have to be careful in their construction of the people when demographic factors mean there is no single dominant group, in this case based on ethnicity, within a society. Like Resnick, Cheeseman recognises the multifaceted nature of populist leadership across the numerous different definitions of the concept. And I think this is an approach which would be useful to apply in all the contexts that we've seen, right? Taking a bit from each. If you remember back to the week on British populism and the piece I wrote on Jeremy Corbyn being a populist, we use a mixture of different measures of populism there to come to a conclusion. And it's a kind of cheap plug, I guess. Cheeseman and Lama have identified a number of ethnopopulist parties that seek to combine the ethnic appeal of party leaders within their own communities, especially in rural areas, in addition to a broader populist message that is usually more effective in cosmopolitan urban constituencies. Furthermore, Cheeseman argues that there is strong evidence that the feasibility of a party running a pure populist campaign is related to the degree of urbanisation, amongst other factors. So the more urbanised an area is, a country is, the more likely populist strategies are to be successful, because you've taken away the strength of ethnic siloisation in, say, villages and rural communities. However, the tension between ethnic and populist appeals tends to undermine the viability of these movements, preventing leaders from achieving electoral success on the basis of the kind of cross-ethnic inclusionary populism that we might see in Latin America or Southern Europe. Hence, hopes that populism might be inclusive and might provide an avenue for dampening down ethnic tensions is in some cases misplaced, and it might actually be that populism can only replace these type of ethnic bids for power once urbanisation as a process has kind of kicked in or reached a critical mass. Cheeseman identifies two key questions relating to ethnopopulism in Africa. How does populism relate to ethnic politics, and is Afro-populism really just ethno-nationalism in disguise? African politics is driven by high levels of ethnic political mobilisation, and most studies conclude that ethnicity is the most powerful explanation of electoral behaviour, which is apparently a roadblock to populist appeals, especially to a homogenous people, as I mentioned in a previous slide. As Cheeseman notes, appealing to voters on the basis of the need to defend the interests of the common man implies a form of solidarity rooted in class or economic status that doesn't fit well with ethnic politics and its emphasis on sectional divisions. Whilst populism has the potential to be relatively inclusive, leaders pledging to improve the position of the disenfranchised, whatever their ethnic or racial identity, the logic of ethnic politics is inherently exclusionary. Indeed, the notion that individuals should vote for a candidate of their own ethnicity, who is in turn expected to deliver benefits back to their own community, effectively casts members of other ethnic groups as rivals or outsiders. And that was from Cheeseman, 2018, page 362. One way to circle this square, or square this circle, is in contexts where ethnic and class-based disadvantages are coterminous or aligned. So if numerous ethnic groups are held back economically by the political or economic system, it becomes easier to build an inclusive ethnopopulist appeal because the issues are the same, they're rooted in class, but you can talk to different ethnic groups on an ethnic level, for want of a better phrase, but you can have an umbrella concept of the problem being class-based. So the language might be ethnic, but the problem, the other, can be framed in terms of class. Cheeseman notes in such a context, populist and racial or ethnic appeals may both target the same communities without contradiction. However, this interpretation does not really account for the success of populist leaders in countries such as Kenya or Zambia, where there is much inequality within ethnic groups as there is between them. So the assumption there is that, it'd have to be the whole ethnic group would have to be held back by the prevailing economic system. But in the cases where ethnopopulism's been successful, such as Zambia, that wasn't the case. There was inequality, economic inequality within the ethnic groups as well. Some politicians use a dual approach. So Sata in Zambia, who will be our kind of case study, he made traditional left-wing populist appeals which could appeal to all Zambians of that political persuasion, so across ethnic and urban or rural lines. But this kind of left-wing populism was coupled with an explicitly ethnic appeal to the Bemba ethnic community of which he was a part, or with which he identified. Thus, Sata did not simply mobilise in a populist way in urban areas and an ethnic way in rural locales, although there was certainly an element of this, of choosing your crowd. He articulated instead a set of grievances that resonated with both constituencies, but also an additional set of grievances that resonated with the Bemba, who felt like he was one of them. So basically, like across the globe, right, policies and campaigns do matter. However, Sata also made contradictory promises. So he promised to lower food prices for urban workers, which would harm his rural Bemba base who sold those food products, but he also promised to protect the Bemba rural communities. But due to poor information networks, Sata could promise one thing to urban workers and another to ethnic or rural voters and not get caught out. Obviously, this will change, and we'll talk about that later. But with the spread of communication technology across Africa, it will become a lot harder to do that type of thing. But Sata is a rare example of a successful populist and ethnically inclusive politician. So as Cheeseman notes, the case of Kenya demonstrates this tendency well. In the run-up to 2007, Odinga struggled to find a common message to rally his ethnically diverse support base. So instead he formed a pentagon of leaders from each part of the country to back his candidacy, which proved to be an effective way of broadening the reach of his campaign. But, in effect, this made Odinga's candidacy dependent on the ability of regional figures, traditional big men, to deliver their communities. So basically, he relied on ethnic elders to turn out the vote. In other words, despite his populist rhetoric, Odinga attracted a cross-ethnic support base by harnessing diverse ethnic identities and ethnic divisions rather than overcoming this. So he made populist appeals but relied on traditional ethnic networks to deliver the vote. And so we can see that the ability of ethnopopulism to be inclusive relies on high levels of urbanisation, with rural voters seeing their own interests as at least partially dependent on the success of urban areas, and whether ethnic identities have been historically politicised. E.g., in the case of Zambia, Cheeseman says, and this is from page 365, it was the shared interests of rural Bemba and urban voters who both stood to gain from improvements in the pay and conditions for urban workers as a result of the significance of flows of money from urban areas to rural people. So people will go to, young people will go to work in urban areas and send money back home. Remittances, that's the word, which underpinned their common support for populist positions. As a result, Sata was able to run a more inclusive campaign in which voters from a range of ethnic groups were attracted to his political platform, overcoming, if only for a short time, the country's ethno-linguistic divisions. Unfortunately for inclusive ethnopopulism, as Cheeseman concludes, when it comes to the saliency of ethnicity, most African states are closer to Kenya than they are to Zambia. There are few countries in which leaders can hope to win elections on the basis of urban votes alone. As a result, an inclusive populist appeal in urban areas is rarely enough for a leader to secure national power. In turn, this constrains the potential for pure populist strategies to be successful and pushes aspiring candidates towards ethnopopulism. So one important trend here is clearly the rapid pace of urbanisation taking place across Africa, which presumably will make the type of ethnopopulist appeals and successes seen in Zambia much more possible and fruitful in future years. Although information networks will improve as well via mobile, and perhaps a process of economic modernisation could dampen down the importance of ethnic cleavages, or perhaps replace them with other values-based cleavages like we've seen in the West, with the rise of post-materialist or communitarian cosmopolitan values. Or given scarce resources in urban areas like land, perhaps water, it could make group identities even more salient than when people divide themselves based on ethnicity in villages or traditional communities. Basically, it's all to play for. But ethnopopulism seems to work better or be more inclusive when what is good for urban areas is good for rural areas, and vice versa. When there's no relationship between the two in terms of their interests, then it's harder to build that coalition. As we know, populism is a thin-centred ideology. However, another thin-centred ideology has been much more important in Africa's political history: nationalism. Nationalism is the desire that the nation should be housed in its own sovereign state. A nation is a collection of people bound together by common values and traditions, often sharing the same values, traditions, language, history, and affiliation to a geographical area. So obviously nationalism has been important due to the kind of struggle against imperialism, the desire to build cohesive nation states after independence from colonial rule. Of course, unlike with European nations, African nations as we know them today were structured by colonial mapmakers rather than organic demands from the bottom up. And thus nationalities and states are not often congruous. So there are often conflicting nations within a given state. Ethiopia at the moment is a great example. Well, it's not a good example because there's a civil war going on, but is an example of this phenomenon. Like with populism, not all African countries share a common ideology, right? That should go without saying. Numerous distinct shades of nationalism have emerged, which Thompson classes as African socialism, scientific socialism, populism, and state capitalism. Obviously, our interest is with populism, but we'll cover the other three first. So African socialism argued that after independence, dependence on the West needed to be reduced, and that liberalism and capitalism were the tools of the oppressor. African socialism rejected Western or Soviet or Eastern communism, arguing that the theories of Marx and Engels didn't apply to Africa. Classical theories of socialism, for example, saw the proletariat as a revolutionary class that would defeat the bourgeoisie. In Africa, with its small industrial base, there was no real working class to talk of, nor were there societies marked by massive inequalities, because poverty was much more endemic. And so, African socialism stressed the continent's traditional values. African leaders portrayed their communities as having been classless, communitarian and egalitarian prior to colonial rule. Now this wasn't true, right? But it was a myth that African socialist leaders kind of told themselves to justify their rule and their approach, right? And every nation relies on some elements of myth-making. But this myth was just patently false. And the leaders sought to combine the idealised classless and communitarian nature of village life with modern production methods backed by a modern state, and skip the developmental state outlined in classic Marxist analysis, with the state the engine of development and monopolised the economy, but monopolised politics as well. Both the private sphere and civil society were crowded out. Scientific socialism, on the other hand, was scientific in the sense that it was based on Marxist-Leninist theory. So it wasn't scientific in a kind of laboratory sense, right? But it was based in orthodox communist theory, rooted in criticisms of African socialism, which was seen as being too amorphous or shapeless, and criticised the romanticised notion of African traditional village life, which was seen to mask the reality of underlying class antagonisms. Theory aside, scientific socialism and African socialist governments were not too different in practice. Neither really cozied up to the USSR, and they pretty much all traded more with the West than the USSR, but both faced the realities of international capitalism. Both types of countries lacked the working class consciousness which would lead to working class revolution. State capitalism, on the other hand, was popular in a few countries: the Ivory Coast, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, Cameroon, Morocco and Gabon, which were open to market activity, even if the state did remain the dominant partner in the market in order to ensure the goals of African nationalism and development were met. And so the state was also heavily intervened in the economy to ensure strategic economic development. Thompson argues that populist nationalism was closely associated with military government and coup d'etat. As Thompson notes, all of these populist governments, however, faced identical problems. Those commanding the state's core executive were reluctant to devolve too much power to local communities. They feared the consequences of losing control, despite their rhetoric of removing power from the elites. In reality, nationalist demands of building tight central authority in order to maintain national unity and coherent economic development overrule populist demands of letting the masses truly administer themselves. Devolution would only go so far. Thompson says this is why Pearl Robinson talks of the state trying to over-control politics in Burkina Faso, while she suggested that there was only a facade of quasi-democratic institutions. Robinson concluded that the objective function of grassroots participation was subversive of the ruler's intent. The state president and members of the core executive, as in all other African political systems, remain very much in control. In reality, the African populist experiment proved to be more useful as a method for the state to penetrate civil society than it was for civil society to penetrate the state. That was quite a quote. But essentially, when it comes to populist nationalism or nationalist populism in Africa, nationalism won out, not populism. And whereas in Latin America, it was theorized that populism would help on the way to democracy, this hasn't been the case in Africa to any significant extent. The populisms of both the 1980s and the 2000s were precipitated by disappointment with democratic experiments and the emergence of a corrupt elite that appeared detached from the poor masses. The populism of the 1980s was generally driven by outsiders, particularly military leaders, who thus had freedom to implement radical plans for restructuring society, sidelining existing bureaucratic administrative structures and creating new grassroots structures themselves, often in conflict with traditional sources of authority, which those 1980s populists sought to challenge. They had fairly similar economic policies, interventionist and nationalist, and although concerned with the poor in general, they gave special weight to the plight of the peasants in rural areas. They were the people. And so the 1980s populism sought in many ways to subvert traditional hierarchies. Contrastingly, the economic ideologies of contemporary populist leaders, has been highly varied. Their main constituency has been the young urban poor, and they've often courted traditional authorities rather than subvert them, where it helps to gain votes among particular ethnic and religious groups. Cheeseman notes a key weakness in populism in Africa is that, in relying on the active engagement and participation of the public in the populist performance, populism does not simply involve politicians performing to the people, it involves the people being involved and being part of that performance. But once the public stop being willing to engage in that performance, so once a country's populist moment has passed, such as they say in Zambia, populist politicians are vulnerable to apathy, public disappointment, and thus replacement by rivals. To that end, Fraser writes in 2017, we might describe the Zambian scene as post-populist. Politicians are still keen to try on populist costumes, but the people have increasingly left them alone and insecure on the stage. So, this ties into the demand side. Voters need to demand populism for populism to become successful and to become entrenched. The core rules of electoral democracy, party politics, don't change based on the context, right? Parties still need voters, and that means that they have to meet the demand of some voters. So, is populism in Africa unique? Well, there are unique elements, right? Context is important. But at its core, there is a people, there is an elite, and there's a sense of betrayal. There is a moral element.